Welcome to the deep dive. If you've been keeping an eye on the news, you know things in Washington, D.C., and, well, everywhere else have been moving incredibly fast. So today we're going deep on three really interconnected stories that are shaping the American landscape right now. Our mission for you today is simple. We want to untangle this recent Senate budget bill, explore the president's, let's say, evolving legal tactics and their kind of surprising effects, and then really get into this intense debate around the Federal Reserve's independence. You'll walk away with a much clearer picture of all these moving pieces and what they actually mean.
Absolutely. And we've pulled together a really rich set of sources to help us navigate all this. It gives a pretty comprehensive view of these, high-stakes decisions and often the hidden reasons behind them. We're going to try and connect the dots for you between policy, power, and, personal influence, too, help you see the bigger picture.
Right. Let's start with that Senate budget bill. It just passed, and, the vote couldn't have been closer. 51-50. J.D. Vance cast the deciding vote. So who voted no? Well, all the Democrats and independents, naturally, but also three Republicans, Susan Collins, Rand Paul, and Tom Tillis. And, isn't it interesting about Senator Collins? Once again, she sort of manages to rebel.
Right.
But without her vote actually being the one to tip the scales.
Yeah, that's a pattern some observers definitely point out. But what really jumps out here is just the sheer size of this thing. Our sources are calling it a megabill. It's around 1,000 pages. Even longer than the House version, actually.
1,000 pages. Wow.
Yeah. And let's just say it's highly unlikely any senator actually read it cover to cover before voting.
Okay, so what actually is in this beast?
Well, the big ticket items are pretty significant. You've got major tax cuts, primarily benefiting wealthier folks, tougher requirements for Medicaid recipients, cuts to subsidies for green energy and credits for electric vehicles, also reductions in SNAP funding, that's the food stamp program, changes that make it harder to discharge student loan debt, a huge $5 trillion hike in the debt limit.
$5 trillion, okay.
And tax credits for donations to school choice scholarship funds. Now, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, hasn't put out its final score yet.
Right, the nonpartisan scorekeepers.
Exactly. But there's really no doubt this bill is going to add dramatically to the deficit.
And just as important as what's in it is got cut out, right?
Absolutely. Some major things hit the cutting room floor. There was a plan to sell off huge amounts of public land out west that's gone. A proposed tax on wind and solar projects using Chinese components also out. And a provision that would have stopped states from regulating artificial intelligence. Yeah. That didn't make it either. And, it's kind of funny. One source noted that the Senate parliamentarian, basically the rules referee, ended up cutting more items from the bill than all 100 senators combined.
That's wild. Okay, so we see what's in, what's out. But how did something this contentious, with so many moving parts, actually manage to pass that 51-50 vote? This is where Senator Lisa Murkowski comes in, right? Her vote was key.
It really was. And to understand it, you kind of have to rewind about 7 years. Remember Senator John McCain's famous thumbs down vote that saved Obamacare?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Dramatic moment.
Well, Murkowski was also a no vote back then. Yeah. And she famously turned down a deal from Mitch McConnell, who was majority leader at the time. The deal would have exempted Alaska from the changes to the ACA, but she rejected it, apparently out of a sense of fairness to other states.
Right, I remember that. So fast forward to now.
Right. So this time, it was a very similar situation. The current majority leader, John Thune, needed just one more vote. He needed either Murkowski, Collins, Tillis, or Paul. Now, Paul and Tillis were seen as pretty much definite no's. Collins, she's facing a tough re-election campaign.
Okay.
So Murkowski became, let's say, the most likely target. Thune offered her basically the same kind of deal as before.
Yeah.
Exempt Alaska from the proposed cuts to Medicaid and SNAP.
And this time?
This time she took the deal. Now, the parliamentarian did end up striking down the specific Medicaid exemption part.
Oh, okay.
But it got sort of replaced with about $50 billion in new funding targeted at certain types of rural hospitals. The kind that, wouldn't you know it, happened to be quite common in Alaska.
$50 billion? That's quite a replacement. So how did people react? Our sources seemed pretty critical of her explanation.
Yeah, they didn't mince words. One described her tears after the vote as crocodile tears. So her claims about having to do it for Alaskans were either dishonest or naive. She did admit she didn't actually like the final bill and said she hoped the House would fix it. But, the source points out the House is way more conservative and they were the ones pushing for the Medicaid cuts in the first place. So that hope seems unlikely.
Yeah, that doesn't quite add up. And Senator Rand Paul really went after her, didn't he?
He did. Slammed her publicly. Said she basically took a bailout for Alaska and threw everyone else under the bus.
And her response?
According to one reporter, when asked about Paul's comments, she just gave this furious stare for like 10 seconds, and then finally stammered something about her obligation to the people of Alaska.
Intense. Okay, so the bill passes the Senate. What happens now in the House?
Well, predictably, the Freedom Caucus members are not happy. They're saying they can't vote for the Senate version.
But will they stick to that?
History suggests maybe not. One source rather bluntly says they eventually fold like a cheap suit every time they make these kinds of threats. So, we'll see. Talks just started today, July 2nd.
And there's this July 4th deadline hanging over everything. Trump wants it on his desk by then.
Yeah, he set that deadline. Says he wants the pageantry of signing it on Independence Day.
Pageantry, right.
But our sources are pretty skeptical that pageantry is the real driver here. Deadlines like this are incredibly useful tools. They force Congress to move fast, often before members can fully read what they're voting on, or before constituents can really weigh in.
Creates urgency, limits scrutiny.
Exactly. And plus there's this tactic, kind of Nixonian, that Trump uses regularly.
Yeah.
Drop potentially bad news or controversial stuff over a weekend, or in this case, a holiday weekend when people aren't paying as much attention. Mute the coverage.
Makes sense. Okay, let's pivot now. Another major theme from our sources is the president's approach to the legal system. He's often described as using lawsuits very strategically.
That's putting it mildly. One source says he puts the frivolous in frivolous lawsuits, often using them just to delay payments or pressure opponents into concessions.
And the Paramount settlement is a key example here.
It really is.
Yeah.
So Trump sued CBS's 60 Minutes program for defamation. The claim was they edited an interview with Kamala Harris in a way that misrepresented her, made her look better, and that this somehow personally damaged him.
Which sounds odd.
Yeah, our sources flat out call it a meritless claim. That's just not how defamation law works. You generally need to show a false statement of fact, cause actual harm to your reputation, not just that an opponent looked good in an edited interview.
So if the claim was weak, why on earth did Paramount settle?
Well, that's where the strategy comes in. Our sources lay out a few key reasons. First, Trump has basically unlimited resources and willingness to drag things out in court forever. Defending against that, even if you eventually win, gets incredibly expensive.
Right, bleed them dry financially.
Pretty much. Second, he's very effective at turning his base against companies or media outlets he targets. That can mean lower viewership, lost advertising revenue, real financial pain. And finally, the big one here. Paramount, the parent company of CBS, had a huge merger pending. As president, Trump had the power to potentially interfere with that, complicate it, maybe even kill it outright. We're talking potential losses in the hundreds of millions, maybe billions.
Wow. So huge leverage.
Massive leverage. So they settled. The deal was $16 million in cash.
$16 million?
Yeah, but it went to his Presidential Library Foundation, not directly into his pocket. They also agreed to give about $14 million worth of free advertising and PSAs promoting conservative causes. And they agreed to release unedited transcripts of any future interviews with presidential candidates.
Paramount tried to spin those last points as wins, right? Like, see, he didn't get the money directly, and we didn't have to apologize.
Yeah, but our sources found that argument laughable. They argue the lines between Trump the person, Trump the business, Trump the foundation, Trump the paytayee. They're basically meaningless.
It's all fungible.
Exactly. They suggest he can easily find ways to use that $16 million for personal benefit, fixing up Mar-a-Lago, paying family members, whatever. One source even quotes Oliver Wendell Holmes, sort of paraphrasing, saying Trump has a second-class intellect, but he's a first-class grifter.
Strong words. But the core point is this settlement shows a way to use presidential power for personal financial gain and also to force private companies to push a political agenda.
Precisely. Our sources connect those two aspects very directly. The financial part they compare to, like mafia protection money. The political agenda part, they invoke the historical image of the black shirts, forcing compliance.
Heavy comparisons.
Very. And they even speculate the whole thing might have been planned before the 60 Minutes interview even aired, like setting up the pretext.
Okay, so that's the Paramount case. But this isn't a one-off, is it? There's a next wave of lawsuits.
Seems like it. And one looks remarkably similar. Trump is suing Ann Seltzer, a well-respected pollster, and the Des Moines Register newspaper for fraud.
Fraud? What?
Because Seltzer's final poll before the 2024 election predicted Kamala Harris would win Iowa. But Trump actually won the state.
Wait. He won. How is that fraud that damaged him?
Exactly the question our sources raise. It seems completely counterintuitive.
So what's the legal maneuvering here?
Well, his lawyers first tried to dismiss the case in federal court without prejudice, meaning they could refile it. Why? Because a new Iowa state law just took effect yesterday, making these kinds of lawsuits much harder to win.
Timing.
Yep. So they quickly refiled the same lawsuit in Iowa state court, just under the wire, to try and use the older, more favorable version of the law.
And the goal here isn't really winning damages, is it?
Probably not.
Yeah.
Our sources figure he'll mostly use it to, as they put it, bloviate about being a victim, fuel the narrative.
But does this fight actually make sense for him? Strategically, he's not likely to get a big payout like with Paramount. No free media advertising.
Right. And interestingly, the defense for Seltzer and the Register is being handled pro bono for free by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And our sources say FIRE would love, love, love the chance to take Trump on publicly over this. They think he might end up looking pretty foolish, with lots of egg on his face.
Interesting. An opponent eager for the public fight. What else is happening on the lawsuit front?
There's another one down in Los Angeles. The Department of Justice is suing the city, the mayor, Karen Bass, and the city council.
Over what?
They're arguing LA's sanctuary city policies are causing violence, chaos, and attacks on law enforcement, and leading to lawlessness, rioting, looting, and vandalism.
Strong accusations. Is there a legal basis?
Well, our sources can see there might be a legitimate argument that some of LA's specific immigration policies could potentially overstep federal authority, but they argue the DOJ lawsuit is mostly just posturing and spending lots of hot air. Why? Because in their view, LA is an easy target. It's a blue city in a blue state, predominantly non-white population.
So a useful bugaboo, as the source puts it, political theater.
That's the assessment. Yeah, a convenient enemy for the administration's base.
Okay, so Trump himself seems pretty adept at using the legal system, delaying things, applying pressure. But what about the people working for him, carrying out these plans?
That's where things get trickier. Our sources suggest that while Trump might be well-armored legally, his underlings are much more vulnerable. Their armor is far less impenetrable.
Why is that?
Several reasons. Many of them aren't government employees, so they don't have the same legal protections. A lot of the questionable actions could be state-level crimes or civil offenses, things that presidential pardons can't touch.
Right. Pardons are mostly for federal crimes.
Exactly. And if they're lawyers, they can face consequences from their state bar associations. Losing your law license in a bar court hearing can sometimes be easier than getting convicted in a criminal or civil trial. Their careers are directly on the line.
And we're seeing examples of this play out.
We really are. Just recently, Kenneth Chesebro, he was one of the architects of the fake elector scheme. He just lost his law license in New York for unethical conduct. His appeal was denied. John Eastman, another lawyer central to the efforts to overturn the 2020 election, who pushed those theories and, according to courts, lied in legal filings.
Yeah.
He was disbarred in California. The ruling cited multiple acts of moral turpitude. His appeal also rejected.
Disbarred. That's serious.
Very serious. And then you have someone like Mike Lindell, the MyPillow founder. His relentless pushing of 2020 election conspiracies has absolutely wrecked his business and reputation. He just lost another lawsuit this week. This one was brought by Eric Coomer, formerly of Dominion Voting Systems. Lindell had accused Coomer of being a traitor, part of the conspiracy.
What was Lindell's defense?
Basically, he argued that if you genuinely believe something is true, even if it's false, it can't be defamatory. The jury didn't buy it.
And the verdict.
They awarded Coomer $2.3 million. Now, given all the other judgments against Lindell, Coomer might never actually see that money. But there's still real value, our sources argue, in having a court and a jury officially declare that these claims were, in fact, lies.
Yeah, the public record matters. And Lindell, Chesebro, Eastman, they join others like Rudy Giuliani, Jenna Ellis, who've also faced disbarment or hefty judgments. So the big question is, are the people currently, doing the president's bidding, are they looking at these examples? Are they getting nervous about what might happen to their careers, their lives down the road?
It certainly raises that question. The potential consequences are becoming clearer and clearer.
Okay, let's shift to our final major topic, the Federal Reserve. An institution usually seen as independent, but now facing intense scrutiny. Our sources even float this really provocative idea that, quote, Fed independence is already dead.
Yeah, it's a stark argument. The reason goes something like this. Central banks don't have some God-given right to be independent. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that sets up the Fed to operate like a shadow government, making policy outside the normal political process.
And President Trump's rhetoric towards the current Fed chair, Jay Powell, has been intense.
Oh, absolutely relentless. Trump has called Powell low IQ, a very stupid person, terrible, a major loser, Mr. Too Late, and even a total and complete moron. Just scathing personal attacks.
And this fits a pattern, right?
It does. Our sources point out Trump has already effectively purged the top leadership at the military, the CIA, NSA, FBI, the Justice Department. So they argue it would actually be out of character if he didn't go after the Fed too.
So why? Why is he so focused on getting control over interest rates, over the Fed's bond buying programs?
Our sources suggest it's basically an admission, perhaps an unconscious one, that his own fiscal policies, particularly that big, beautiful bill we talked about earlier, the budget plan, are really straining the limits of U.S. debt.
Oh, so?
Well, the CBO, as we mentioned, projects that draft bill adds another $3.3 trillion to the deficit by 2034. And a huge chunk of that comes from just making the Trump 1.0 tax cuts permanent.
Okay, so the debt picture is getting worse. Connect that to the Fed.
Right. So the bigger picture, according to these sources, is that the U.S. is caught in a runaway debt compound trap. Think of compound interest, but for national debt, and it's spiraling. Our budget deficit is already high, 6.7% of GDP, even with the economy supposedly at full employment. If we hit a recession, that could easily jump into double digits.
And the cost of servicing that debt?
It's climbing fast. Interest payments were 1.6% of GDP back in 2018. This year, they're expected to be 3.2%. That makes the whole federal budget incredibly sensitive to any changes in interest rates.
Wow, doubled in just a few years.
Exactly. And we're apparently about to cross this threshold called the Niall-Ferguson rule, named after the historian, which basically says great powers start to decline when the cost of paying interest on their debt exceeds their military spending.
That sounds ominous.
It does. And just look at the overall debt level. Net public debt was about 54% of GDP back around the year 2000. Now, it's 121%. And heading towards 140%.
So what's driving this massive increase? Is it just demographics, social programs?
Those play a role, certainly demographics, middle-class entitlements. But interestingly, our sources also point a finger directly at the era of independent central banks.
Hey, they're saying independent central banks contributed to the debt problem. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But the argument is this. Have these powerful, unelected, overmighty technocrats, as one source calls them, actually made things better? They argue that these economists, these econometric presbyters, have made serious and repeated mistakes in monetary policy. They were supposedly in thrall to economic models that had a built-in bias towards creating more debt.
How so?
Well, they focused intensely on keeping consumer price inflation low, which was easy when China was flooding the world with cheap manufactured goods.
Right, that kept prices down.
But while they were focused on consumer prices, they let asset price inflation, think stocks, real estate run wild, and they allowed huge debt bubbles to form, which, of course, blew up spectacularly in 2008.
Okay, I see the argument. And they point to other central banks, too.
Oh, yeah. The European Central Bank gets singled out, described as being like Vatican City answerable to no one. The claim is the ECB actually caused Europe's lost decade of growth by tightening monetary policy too much, pushing half the Eurozone into a debt crisis it didn't need to have.
Wow.
And it gets worse. The source claims the ECB used instruments of financial torture, basically, threatening financial stability to effectively force out elected governments in Greece and Italy. And they sent secret letters demanding Spain and Italy change their constitutions and labor laws.
Secret letters dictating policy. That's quite an accusation against an independent central bank.
It is. And they also argue the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, they all made a hash of COVID inflation. They kept pushing quantitative easing, pumping money into the system long after the economic recovery was clearly underway, making inflation worse.
So the argument is, maybe this independence isn't all it's cracked up to be. And historically, the Fed wasn't always this independent.
Not at all.
Yeah.
That's a really key point from our sources. For most of its 111-year history, the Fed wasn't truly independent in the way we think of it now. Until 1937, they didn't even have their own building. They met in a borrowed room in the Treasury Department.
Seriously?
Yeah. And one former chairman, Mariner Eccles, later complained that during his tenure, he was basically just a cipher who did whatever the Treasury told him to do.
So when did the president start really leaning on the Fed?
President Harry Truman is a prime example. He apparently harassed Eccles' successor relentlessly because the guy wouldn't agree to just buy up all the government debt needed to keep bond yields low after World War II.
What happened?
Truman basically forced him into something called the Fed Treasury Accord. Our sources call it total subjugation. The Fed essentially agreed to keep interest rates artificially low.
Then the effect of that.
It helped wipe out a lot of America's war debt, but it did it through something called financial repression and by letting inflation run into double digits. Basically, savers and bondholders got screwed.
So Truman bullied the Fed chair into submission.
Pretty much. He eventually forced the guy to resign. And Truman even accused him publicly of serving Stalin's interests for wanting higher interest rates.
Wow. Using foreign adversaries.
Yeah, our sources speculate Trump might find appealing today, maybe swapping Stalin for Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
And it didn't stop with Truman. Even Paul Volcker.
The guy famous for taming inflation in the 80s?
That's the one. Even he got bullied. Ronald Reagan's chief of staff apparently called him up in 1984 and explicitly ordered him not to raise interest rates before the presidential election.
So this idea of presidential interference isn't new at all.
Not even close. Eduardo Campanella, an analyst at Unicredit, basically says Trump is just trying to turn back the clock to how things used to be, the historical norm.
And it's not just Republicans pushing on the Fed's autonomy.
No, our sources point out Democrats have also chipped away at it. Many on the left have been pushing the Fed to take on mandates beyond just inflation and employment, things like fighting climate change or addressing social injustice. That also arguably erodes its traditional independence.
Okay, so legally, can the president just fire the Fed chair? Powell's term runs until 2026.
Technically, the law says Fed board members can only be removed for cause during their 14-year terms, but...
Trump has fired lots of officials with similar protections before.
Exactly. Our sources point out he's removed dozens of top people from agencies where the law supposedly protected them. So could he fire Powell before May 2026? Maybe. He could try to invent some fictitious emergency as justification.
Or find other ways to sideline him.
Right. He could try to emasculate Powell by appointing a loyalist as a shadow chairman, someone waiting in the wings, constantly pushing for rate cuts, undermining Powell's authority. Apparently, a team of Trump loyalists even drafted a secret 10-page memo before the election outlining ways to break any resistance within the Fed.
A secret plan. Okay, this raises the crucial question. If Trump does manage to capture the Fed, bring it under his control, will it actually give him the economic results he wants?
That's the million-dollar or maybe trillion-dollar question.
Yep.
There was a moment back in April when Trump was openly talking about firing Powell.
Yeah. What happened?
The bond market reacted badly. The bond vigilantes, as they're called, big investors who punish governments, they see as fiscally irresponsible by selling off their bonds.
They pushed back?
They did. Long-term interest rates shot up the rates that influence mortgages and corporate borrowing costs. It was called Trump's Truss moment.
Like Liz Truss in the UK, whose unfunded tax cuts tanked the British bond market.
Exactly like that. It was a reminder that there's this global deep state of financial markets, as one source put it, that can actually be more powerful than even a U.S. president. Global capital basically trumped Trump himself.
But rates have calmed down since then.
They have settled a bit. But the question our sources ask is, have investors just been lulled into complacency? Or is this just the calm before the next storm?
What could trigger another storm?
Well, think about the tariffs Trump is proposing. The price increases from those won't hit immediately. There's a lag. Importers built up big inventories before the tariffs took effect. It takes weeks for those higher-priced goods to actually reach consumers.
The tariff fog, as the source calls it.
Yeah, the Fed is probably right to wait to hold off on cutting rates until they can see clearly through that fog. And they also need to figure out the economic impact, potentially stagflationary, meaning high inflation, and slow growth of things like mass deportations.
So forcing the Fed to cut rates now could be dangerous.
Very dangerous, according to these sources. If Trump forces the Fed into, quote, Turkish-style monetary expansion, meaning politically driven easing that ignores economic fundamentals, you could see a massive global exodus from U.S. debt markets.
Foreign investors dumping U.S. bonds.
Exactly. Because Trump's ultimate plan seems to be compelling the Fed to just buy up U.S. debt to keep interest rates artificially low, regardless of inflation or the economy.
And the endgame of that?
Our sources warn that path leads straight to a collapse of the dollar and the path to perdition. They bring up the Rudy Dornbush rule, named after another famous economist.
What's the rule?
It says, Crises take longer to arrive than you can possibly imagine, but when they do come, they happen faster than you can possibly imagine.
Chilling thought. Wow. What a journey we've taken through all these interconnected issues. We've really seen how, one single budget bill can ripple through Senate politics, blow up the national debt, and then directly impact the independence or lack thereof of the Federal Reserve. And all of that is happening while these legal strategies are evolving, blurring those lines between personal gain, political power, and institutional norms. We really hope this deep dive gave you some of those aha moments and maybe a clearer, more nuanced view of these really pivotal events shaping our world.
Absolutely. And as you think about everything we've discussed, maybe mull over this question. We've seen the history, right? Presidents have influenced the Fed before. We see these legal pressure tactics becoming more assertive. So if these trends collide, more political control over the Fed, combined with aggressive legal maneuvering, how might that fundamentally redefine the balance of power, not just in American government, but in the global economy in the years ahead?
Definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Stay curious and keep seeking those deeper insights.